Good morning everyone and welcome to our webinar this morning, which is the next instalment of our series on lease negotiation tips for landlords and tenants. Today is Thursday the 9th of June 2022. This webinar will be recorded and it will be circulated to those of you who have attended today, as well as posted on our YouTube channel. It will last around 30 to 40 minutes. So in today's webinar we'll be covering three topics: guarantees and indemnities, dilapidations and yielding up, and the latest on the Mees Regulations. Each of these topics is quite wide and it could easily stand a webinar by itself, but we'll aim to take you through a brief legal background to each subject and then provide some practical tips for landlords and tenants to think about in the context of commercial leases. So our approach to leases is very much based on thinking critically through the lifetime of the lease and the issues which may arise during the course of the occupation of a building by a tenant, whilst dealing with the commercial reality that our clients, whether they're the landlord or the tenant, they just want to get on with the transaction as efficiently and effectively as possible. At Myosin, our contentious and non-contentious property teams work very closely together to ensure seamless advice is given to our clients and to ensure the client has the best guidance on strategy and options at all stages. So with that in mind, I'm joined today by Karen Taylor, who's a Senior Associate in our Real Estate Litigation team, and Sarah McNair, who is an Associate in our Core Real Estate team. I'm now going to pass you over to Sarah and Karen, who will kick things off by going through some points on guarantees and indemnities.
Thanks, Jo. So starting with guarantees and indemnities. In the current climate, a landlord may want to consider having the benefit of extra security in the event that the tenant fails to comply with the provisions of the lease. One of the options a landlord can consider at the outset when negotiating heads of terms is the requirement for a guarantor. This will be particularly relevant where a tenant's financial strength is insufficient to convince the landlord that the tenant will be able to pay the rent and comply with the repair and other covenants throughout the term. Although a landlord may think about asking for a guarantor, they should also consider whether they should be seeking just a guarantee from the third party or a guarantee and an indemnity. Whilst they may look similar, there is a clear distinction between them. A guarantee is a promise given by the guarantor that it will ensure that the tenant complies with its obligations in the event that the tenant fails to perform them. A guarantee is a secondary obligation. An indemnity involves the guarantor agreeing to compensate the landlord for the loss suffered as a result of the tenant's failure to comply with the obligations in the lease. An indemnity is a primary obligation and does not rely on the tenant defaulting. Karen, as a litigator, you are often instructed by landlords where there has been a failure to comply with the lease and will be considering the options available. Can you explain in more detail the differences between a guarantee and indemnity and why it matters?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. If the landlord only has a guarantee, which is a secondary obligation, then the guarantor is only liable if the tenant is liable and fails to perform their obligations. Guarantees are more vulnerable than indemnities, but by way of an example, if the tenant's covenants are void or unenforceable, then the guarantee will also be unenforceable. In addition, if the tenant is discharged from its liability, then the guarantor will also be discharged. By comparison, because an indemnity is an agreement by the guarantor to compensate the landlord if the tenant defaults, in circumstances where the tenant is discharged from their liability, the indemnity will remain valid and the landlord can pursue the guarantor under the indemnity. When it comes to enforcing tenant covenants in the lease, the indemnity provides greater security for the landlord and may give the landlord more options in terms of who to pursue. Sarah, given how important it is for a landlord to be able to enforce a guarantee and indemnity, do you want to talk about the formalities that need to be complied with?
Yes, thanks, Karen. For a guarantee to be valid, it must be in writing and signed by the guarantor. There must also be consideration if it is not executed as a deed. Given that leases are executed as a deed, this is rarely an issue. There are no formal requirements for an indemnity. However, it would still have to meet the requirements for a valid contract to be enforceable. That is, there must be offer, acceptance, and consideration, as well as intending to enter into a legal relationship with one another. Because the agreement by the guarantor in relation to a lease is generally contained in the lease itself, and commercial leases are executed as deeds, problems about whether or not a guarantee and/or indemnity has been validly created rarely arise in practice. Landlords need to be very careful of varying leases where there is a guarantor. Karen, do you want to explain this and some of the problems and key points to be aware of?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. Guarantees are construed strictly. One thing that can release a guarantor is a variation to the lease. The rule is that unless the variation is clearly insubstantial or self-evidently will not prejudice the guarantor, that the guarantor will be released from all liability where there is a binding variation of the contract which the guarantor does not consent to.
To prevent guarantors being released inadvertently, leases normally have wording in them to prevent this from happening. Karen, will this wording automatically protect the landlord?
Although it is prudent to have the wording in the lease, it won't automatically protect the landlord because the courts construe it strictly against the landlord and in favour of the guarantor. In the case of Totland Portfolio against Smith's News Trading, a guarantor was released following a licence for alterations that the guarantor was not a party to. The licence allowed extensive structural alterations that were otherwise prohibited by the lease. This was because the increased scope of the repairing obligations created a larger burden on the guarantor should the tenant default. Another example is rent reviews and rent review memorandums. The purpose of the memorandum is simply to document that a rent review has taken place and the outcome of it. If the procedure that has been set out in the lease has been followed, then the memorandum recording the outcome is unlikely to be a variation of the lease because it's a process that was envisaged by the parties when the lease was entered into. That said, if the parties did not follow the procedure set out in the lease, then that could amount to a variation and release the guarantor if they do not sign the rent review memorandum. It's therefore prudent to ask the guarantor to sign the memorandum. One other point to note is that a surrender and regrant will release the guarantor because the surrender brings the lease to an end and the regrant creates a new landlord and tenant relationship. This can happen inadvertently where the parties agree to increase the length of the term or increase the extent of the premises.
So the clear message is that although most commercial leases do have a provision to say the liability of the guarantor will not be affected by a future variation, landlords need to ensure that the guarantor's consent is always obtained to any variation so as to avoid any arguments and subsequent litigation.
Now turning to another area where landlords are often looking for additional protection, dilapidations. It's essential for landlords to maintain the value of their assets, and that involves ensuring that they are kept in good repair and condition. Most leases include an obligation on the tenant to keep the premises at a certain level of repair and condition. They also include obligations in relation to the redecoration that a tenant must do during and at the end of the term, and set out the landlord's requirements in relation to the reinstatement of the premises where the tenant has undertaken alterations. Sarah, can you briefly run through how the wording which is negotiated in relation to the repair and reinstatement provisions impacts on the tenant's liability?
Yes, thanks, Karen. A tenant will usually covenant to keep the premises in repair. A covenant to keep the property in repair includes an obligation to put the property into repair if it is in disrepair at the start of the lease. Many leases require the tenant to keep the premises in good repair, good and tenantable repair, or good and substantial repair. Case law suggests that generally these additional words do not add anything to the obligation to repair. However, adding the word condition would make the tenant's repair liability more onerous and would indicate a requirement to do more than just keep the premises in repair. Tenants therefore often seek to limit their repair obligation to simply keeping the property in repair to avoid assuming a more onerous obligation. Tenants may also require a photographic schedule of condition to be annexed to the lease to evidence the state of repair of the premises at the start of the lease and to limit their obligations so that they will not be required to put the premises into any better state of repair than it was in at the start of the lease, as evidenced by the schedule of condition. When dealing with repair on the grant of a renewal lease, it is important to expressly state in the renewal lease that the tenant's obligation in relation to repair relates to the state of the premises as it was in at the date of the grant of the previous lease, and not the date of the grant of the renewal lease. This is particularly important where the tenant has not fully complied with the repair obligation in the previous lease. If this is not dealt with in the renewal lease, the tenant will not be obliged to repair and reinstate to the standard as at the grant of the previous lease, and instead the repair obligation will be applied by reference to the start of the term of the renewal lease.
Ultimately, if a tenant fails to comply with the repair covenants, the landlord may have a terminal dilapidations claim against the tenant at the end of the lease. Sarah, is there any way that landlords can get more control over the repair and maintenance of the premises during the actual term?
Yes, we do this by negotiating the inclusion of what we call a Jervis and Harris provision in the lease. This provision allows a landlord to give notice to the tenant to carry out works, and if the tenant doesn't comply, the landlord can enter the property during the term of the lease, carry out repair works and recover the costs from the tenant. Karen, from a litigation perspective, why are these types of clauses useful?
Jervis and Harris provisions are really helpful as generally landlords' remedies for disrepair during the term are limited. For example, a Section 146 notice is required before forfeiture and specific performance is a discretionary remedy. This means that the court will only allow it in rare circumstances, for example, where works are urgent and the landlord has no right to undertake the works itself. Normally, the court deems other remedies to be more appropriate. Clearly, including a provision giving the landlord the power to do works itself is helpful in its own right. However, there are two further benefits of utilising the clause. Firstly, the cost of the repairs can be recovered as a debt rather than damages, as is the case in a terminal dilapidations claim. The benefit of that is that the debt is treated as a supply and gathers VAT exposure. In addition, debts can be recovered from former tenants and guarantors, which links back to our earlier discussion on guarantees and indemnities.
Thanks, Karen. Are there any other benefits to utilising a Jervis and Harris clause?
Yes, they can also be used tactically to ensure that a landlord has a successful terminal dilapidations claim at the end of the lease. Terminal dilapidations claims relating to repair are subject to the statutory cap of Section 18 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927. Using a self-help remedy during the term of the lease avoids the limitations of this statutory cap.
Can you explain what the statutory cap is and the implications for the landlord's terminal dilapidations claim?
Yes, the aim of a terminal dilapidations claim is to put the landlord in the position they would have been in had the tenant complied with its repair covenant. So, for example, where there are no repair costs and where there's no lost rent. The statutory cap limits the amount a landlord can recover from the tenant in respect of such breaches. The statutory cap has two implications for a landlord's claim. Firstly, if the landlord intends to do works to the property, which would make any repair works undertaken by the tenant a complete waste, the landlord cannot recover damages for that disrepair. Secondly, the landlord's claim for damages is capped to either the cost of repairs or the diminution in value of the property as a result of the disrepairs. Therefore, to progress a successful terminal dilapidations claim, a landlord must obtain valuation evidence showing the difference the actual disrepair falling within the covenant makes to the value of the landlord's interest. If the disrepair does not impact on the value of the landlord's interest, there is no claim.
Thanks, Karen. What does the valuer have to be looking at in this situation?
As litigators, we need a valuer to undertake two hypothetical valuations. In the first valuation, the valuer assumes an auction sale of the property in repair, and they identify who will pay the most and the amount that bidder will pay for the property in repair. The second valuation assumes an auction sale of the property in disrepair, which the tenant has left the property in, and identifies what a bidder will be prepared to pay for the property in that disrepair. The difference in those two values is the diminution in value which the tenant is responsible for. So, for example, the market value of the property in repair might be £150,000, but due to the disrepair, it's only worth £100,000. In this situation, the diminution in value is £50,000. Even if it would cost the landlord £75,000 to put the property into the repair required by the lease, if the property is still only going to be worth £150,000 in repair, the landlord's loss is capped at £50,000. At the other extreme, if the cost to bring the property up to the repair is less than the diminution in value, then the landlord's loss is capped at the cost of repairs. Therefore, ultimately, this means that in requiring a tenant to comply with the Jervis and Harris notice during the term, the landlord can recover the cost of those works which may have fallen outside of a terminal dilapidations claim due to being capped by Section 18.
So from what you're saying, Karen, there are a number of things that a landlord should think about including. Firstly, getting a Section 18 valuation survey done early so that they can be realistic about the works which need to be done and the costs of those works. Secondly, considering whether they can do big ticket works, such as works to the roof before the term end date to put the premises in repair and recover the cost of those works from the tenant. This will avoid the Section 18 limitation and will leave works which fall within the cap to be recovered as damages after the lease has expired. And finally, considering whether to, as an alternative, undertake all the works, if it is possible to do so, before term end, or at least take steps to make it look like they are going to do the works, to elicit a payment from the tenant who may be concerned about the works disrupting their business.
That is exactly right, Sarah. There are clearly a lot of benefits to being proactive during the lease term. There are drawbacks which also should be considered. For example, a landlord has to initially fund the cost of the work themselves, and this can involve quite a significant outlay. The second drawback is that a debt claim is of no use if the tenant is not good for the money, and therefore the tenant's financial situation should be considered before undertaking works. Sarah, given the benefits to a landlord in incorporating a Jervis and Harris clause, do you see any pushback from tenants on this point, and what is the basis for that pushback?
A tenant might seek to delete a Jervis and Harris clause altogether from the lease and argue that the landlord has other remedies, such as serving a Section 146 notice or a terminal dilapidations claim at the end of the lease. However, in practice, Jervis and Harris clauses are generally accepted by tenants. Moving on from repair obligations during the term, we'll now touch on the provisions which are relevant at the end of the term. These are known as yield-up provisions. These set out what is expected of a tenant at the end of the term. When the lease comes to an end, the landlord wants to get the property back from the tenant in the physical condition that it should be in if the tenant had complied with its repair, decoration and alteration covenants, without any cost to the landlord. This allows the landlord to re-let the property quickly and maintain the rental income.
That's right, Sarah. Often a yield-up clause will require a tenant to remove fixtures and alterations it's made to the property and make good any damage caused by removal. They can also incorporate various additional landlord remedies, such as a right for the landlord to claim money in addition to the cost of putting the property into the proper state of repair to reflect the loss of potential rental income, and a right for the landlord to dispose of chattels belonging to the tenant that the tenant has left in the property after the end of the term. Sarah, when are the yield-up provisions triggered?
The yield-up provisions are triggered at the term end date, whether that is at the contractual expiry date or when a break right takes effect, for example. A point to be considered carefully where the tenant is yielding up pursuant to a break right is whether the tenant is required to yield up with vacant possession. Karen, what does the case law say about what tenants must do to comply with this obligation?
Yes, there have been some important decisions on this point in recent years. In the case of NYK Logistics against Inbrenda Estates, the court held that the tenant failed to give vacant possession because 2 workmen remained in the property to undertake outstanding repairs. It's therefore essential that a tenant fully vacates the property if it is to yield up the property with vacant possession. Recent case law has also addressed the question as to whether a tenant will have yielded up vacant possession of the property even if they left it in a dysfunctional condition. Capital Park Leeds plc against Global Radio Services Limited is a case from 2020 where the High Court found that in leaving the property in a dysfunctional condition, the tenant had failed to comply with the break condition, which required the tenant to yield up the premises with vacant possession. However, the Court of Appeal have overturned the decision of the High Court and held that a condition for vacant possession requires the tenant to return the property to the landlord free from people, chattels and legal interests rather than being concerned with the physical condition of the property. Moving on from dilapidations now, in the final part of this webinar, we are going to talk a bit about upcoming changes to the Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards, Mees Regulations, which are due to come into force from April next year. Sarah, do you want to tell us about this?
At present, the Mees Regulations mean that since the 1st of April 2018, it has been unlawful to grant a new lease, a renewal lease or a lease extension of a substandard commercial property which has an EPC rating of F or G. From the 1st of April 2023, it will be unlawful to allow a lease of substandard property which may have otherwise been lawfully granted prior to the 1st of April 2018 to continue unless certain exemptions apply. If landlords have not already done so, they need to start thinking about what they should be doing to prepare, and if any action needs to be taken to stay compliant and to minimise the risk of enforcement action. It is important to note that the Mees Regulations do not have any impact on the validity of the letting or the tenant's rights as against the landlord. A lease which is granted in breach of the regulations is still valid, but the landlord puts itself at risk of enforcement action.
Do you have any suggestions or tips on what landlords should be doing to prepare for the changes to the regulations?
Landlords should start by auditing their portfolios and checking whether each property has an EPC rating of at least an E. An initial strategy can then be put in place to set out which properties need prioritising for further action. Landlords should, however, take caution when acting on an existing EPC, as EPC ratings can be subject to significant change through various factors, including a tenant's fit-out, an existing EPC having been carried out several years prior, or a previous EPC simply being poorly prepared. It is important to ensure that an existing EPC is completely accurate before using it as a baseline and considering improvement measures. Landlords should also consider certain factors to establish the urgency with which they should consider addressing a property's EPC rating. For example, if a lease is due to come to an end, before looking at improvements, the landlord should consider whether the rating will improve through the tenant removing their fit-out or whether it is only poor because of the fit-out. It is critical that landlords obtain accurate advice on the current EPC position before taking further steps. A draft EPC can be commissioned that does not have to be lodged, and if it is suitably accurate, then the landlord can use it to decide on next steps. Landlords should not rely on recommendation reports to guide on required improvements, as these are automatically generated by EPC software and may not be accurate.
There are some key exemptions available to commercial landlords, including, firstly, where the landlord has been unable to obtain any required third-party consent to undertake necessary energy improvement works, for example, planning, superior landlord consent or tenant consent, or where consent has been given subject to conditions with which the landlord cannot reasonably comply. Secondly, where an independent surveyor determines that energy improvements are likely to reduce the market value of the property by more than 5%. Thirdly, where an independent assessor determines that all relevant energy improvement works have been carried out, or there are none that can be carried out, and the EPC rating still remains below an E. Or fourthly, where an independent assessor determines that energy improvement works that could be made will not pay for themselves through energy savings within 7 years. In the event of non-compliance, an enforcement authority can impose financial penalties which are set by reference to the property's rateable value. There is a risk of fines of up to £150,000 for non-compliance. Penalties can be levied in respect of each unlawful tenancy. Therefore, in a multi-let building, financial penalties could quickly add up.
Mees obligations are anticipated to step again in the coming years, with government proposals for requirements of a minimum EPC rating of C in 2027 and B in 2030. A consultation proposed a series of deadlines for privately rented, non-domestic buildings between 2023 and 2030. These are that by the 1st of April 2025, buildings that are not exempt must present a valid EPC. By the 1st of April 2027, all buildings must meet a minimum EPC standard of C or have a valid exemption registered. By the 1st of April 2028, landlords must check their EPCs to help identify any properties that require further improvements. And by the 1st of April 2030, buildings must meet a minimum EPC standard of B or have a valid exemption registered.
What changes can landlords make to their leases in light of the upcoming changes to Mees?
It is common practice for leases to include EPC provisions which set out whether or not a tenant can commission an EPC for the property, and if so, what controls are in place surrounding this, such as the tenant only being able to commission an EPC if required by law, and in such a case, either having to use an assessor approved by the landlord or paying the landlord's costs of obtaining the EPC themselves. Some landlords have started to go further than this and now incorporate clauses into their leases relating to environmental performance and recoverability of landlords' energy management costs that are incurred in relation to things such as the supply and consumption of energy or emissions at the property. Some leases also require the tenant to pay the costs incurred by the landlord in carrying out works to the property to improve its environmental performance, but usually only in circumstances where the tenant consents to the landlord doing so.
Thank you, Sarah and Karen. That's been a really useful roundup of some very important issues that need to be carefully considered. I think it's particularly important that we keep an eye on the changing landscape of environmental sustainability and government requirements on that, as they're only likely to get more stringent over the years. Landlords and tenants need to consider how their obligations are going to change over time as a result of emerging government policy, and how that translates as a result of the wording in their leases, both existing and to be taken in the future. So if you have any questions following this webinar, or you have any scenarios you'd like to chat through with us, please do feel free to get in touch at the contact details you will see on the slide. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I do hope you found the webinar interesting and informative. As I said at the start, it will be emailed to those who've signed up, and it will also be available to watch again on our YouTube channel. Details of our next webinar will be circulated shortly, so please do look out for the invitation and sign up to join us again. Thank you and have a good day.